The day Nora Callahan arrived in Dry Creek, Texas, she had exactly $3.40 sewn into the hem of her skirt, a carpet bag with a broken clasp, and the kind of stubborn pride that makes a woman walk into a room full of strangers without flinching even once. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Dry Creek sat at the edge of the Texas hill country like something God had set down and then half forgotten. The main street was a wide stretch of packed red dirt, flanked by a general store, a livery stable, 2 saloons, a Baptist church, and a barber shop whose striped pole leaned at a precarious angle, as though even it had grown weary of the wind. It was not a beautiful town, not by any measure a person might use when thinking about beauty, but it was alive in the way frontier towns are alive, with noise and commerce, and the constant low hum of people trying to make something out of almost nothing. Nora had come west on the Southern Pacific, riding the third-class car where the seats were hard wooden slats and the air smelled of coal smoke and livestock. She had ridden from San Antonio, and before San Antonio she had ridden from New Orleans, and before New Orleans she had come from a small Irish settlement outside of Natchez, Mississippi, where she had buried her mother in February ground so frozen that the gravedigger charged an extra $1. There was no father to speak of, not one who had stayed anyway. There were no brothers, no uncles, no cousins who might extend a hand or a spare room. There was only herself, 22 years old, brown-haired, gray-eyed, and unafraid in the specific way that people who have already lost everything become unafraid, because the worst has already happened. She stepped down from the train with her bag and looked at Dry Creek, and Dry Creek looked back at her with the indifference that small frontier towns reserve for strangers. She had answered an advertisement in the San Antonio Daily Express, placed by a man named Gerald Whitmore, a widower with 2 children, who sought a housekeeper and a woman of good character. The advertisement had said nothing about marriage, and Nora had not thought about marriage. She had thought about work, about steady meals, about 4 walls and a roof that did not belong to a boarding house with rats in the walls. Gerald Whitmore met her at the train platform. He was a thick man of 50, with a gray mustache and the kind of eyes that calculate before they greet. He looked her up and down in the way a man looks at a horse he is considering buying, and something in Nora's chest went cold. "You are Miss Callahan," he said, though it was not a question. "I am," she said. "You look younger than I expected," he said, "and thinner." "I work all the same," she replied, meeting his eyes directly, which seemed to unsettle him. He led her to a buckboard wagon and drove her 3 miles outside of town, to a ranch that was respectable in the way that things maintained by obligation rather than love are respectable. The house was square and painted white, with a porch that needed sweeping and windows that needed washing. 2 children watched from the doorway, a boy of about 9 and a girl perhaps 7, both with their mother's coloring, or so Nora assumed since they looked nothing like Gerald Whitmore. Her work began immediately. There was no period of settling in, no moment of welcome. There was supper to be made and dishes to be washed and floors to be swept, and Gerald Whitmore sat at his table and watched her work with an expression she could not quite name but did not like. That first night, she lay in the small room off the kitchen, listening to the coyotes calling across the dark hills, and she thought that she had made a manageable arrangement and that she would honor it and that she would be all right. She was wrong about Gerald Whitmore. Within 2 weeks, it became clear that the man's intentions had shifted considerably from the terms of the advertisement. He began appearing in the kitchen after the children were abed, sitting at the table with a glass of whiskey, watching her with an interest that had nothing domestic about it. He began suggesting that a woman alone in the world might want to consider the benefits of a more permanent arrangement. He began saying things that required her to leave the room. On a Thursday evening 3 weeks after her arrival, he cornered her in the narrow passage between the kitchen and the pantry and made himself explicit in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Nora said no. He said she had no family to complain to, no name that anyone here would recognize, no dowry, no standing. He said she ought to reconsider. He said it in a way that was meant to make her feel small. She looked at him steadily. "I said no, Mr. Whitmore. I will say it again as many times as you require it." She did not sleep that night. When the gray hour before dawn came, she packed her carpet bag, retrieved the $3.40 from the hem of her skirt, left a note on the kitchen table addressed to the children because they were innocent, and she felt sorry for them, and walked the 3 miles back into Dry Creek with the morning wind at her back. She arrived in town as the sun was coming up, painting the storefronts a color like hammered copper, and she sat down on the bench outside the general store because her feet hurt and she needed one moment to think. She had $3.40. She had no letter of introduction, no local reputation, no family name that would open any door. She was, by every practical measure that the West used to calculate a person's worth, nothing at all. She did not cry. She sat very straight on that bench and looked at the dirt street and counted what she had, which was her 2 hands and her willingness to use them. It was in this moment that Cale Donovan rode into Dry Creek. He came from the north along the main road, riding a bay horse with a black mane, and everything about him was unhurried, the way a man who has spent years making decisions in open country learns to be unhurried. He was 28, lean through the shoulders in the manner of a man who works rather than idles, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and eyes the color of creek water, green-gray and clear. He wore a plain canvas duster over a flannel shirt, and his hat was beaten and brown and pushed back at an angle that might have looked careless on another man, but on him looked simply honest. He rode past the bench where Nora sat, and then he pulled up, not quickly, just gradually, the way you stop when something catches at your attention and you cannot say precisely why. He looked down at her. She looked up at him with the direct gray gaze that had been unnerving people her whole life. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied, in a tone that did not invite conversation but was not rude. He should have ridden on. He had business at the livery stable and then at the general store, and after that he needed to get back to his ranch because the spring calves were coming and he was a man with responsibilities. He absolutely should have ridden on. Instead, he dismounted and wrapped his reins around the hitching post, which was right there in front of the bench anyway, and he stood at a respectful distance and said, "You look like you are doing some serious thinking." "I am," she said. "Anything I can help with." She looked at him again, measuring. She was not naive. She had already encountered one man in this town whose offers of help came with prices she was not willing to pay. But there was something about this man that was different. He was not looking at her the way Gerald Whitmore looked at her. He was looking at her the way a person looks at another person, which sounds simple but in Nora's experience was not simple at all. "I need work," she said, because she was not a woman who believed in dancing around a thing. "I am a good cook, I can keep house, I can mend, I can manage accounts, and I am not afraid of difficult work. I arrived in this town this morning with very little and I need an honest wage." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "What happened to wherever you were before?" he asked, not prying, just asking in a way that was simply practical. "The situation proved unsuitable," she said, which was as much as she intended to say. He nodded once as though that was a perfectly sufficient answer. "I run the Double C Ranch about 5 miles east of town," he said. "I have been looking for someone to manage the house and the cooking since my grandmother passed in January. It is not glamorous work. The house is plain and the hours are long and the wages are fair but not grand. I have 2 ranch hands who eat lunch and supper there daily. The work would be steady." She studied him. "You do not know me at all," she said. "You have no character reference for me, no recommendation." "That is true," he said agreeably, "and you are still offering work." "I am offering work," he said, "because you have an honest face and because I am behind on breakfast, which is a separate but related problem." Something loosened very slightly in Nora's chest. Not much, just a fraction. "My name is Nora Callahan," she said. "Cale Donovan," he said, and reached up to touch the brim of his hat. "Are you hungry, Miss Callahan? Because the cook at Macready's can make a decent plate of eggs, and I think better when I have eaten." She was, in fact, extraordinarily hungry, having not eaten since the previous afternoon. "I can pay for my own meal," she said, with dignity that her $3.40 barely supported. "I did not suggest otherwise," he said pleasantly. They sat across from each other in the small dining room attached to Macready's saloon, which served breakfast to the working men of Dry Creek between 6 and 8 each morning. The room smelled of bacon grease and coffee and old wood, and the light coming through the single window was golden and new, and Nora ate a plate of eggs and salt pork and biscuits with a concentration that she usually reserved for important tasks. Cale Donovan drank his coffee and told her plainly what the work entailed. Cooking breakfast before dawn, packing the midday meal for the hands, cooking supper in the evening, keeping the house swept and ordered, washing the laundry twice a week, managing the pantry and placing orders at the general store. He paid $12 a month plus room and board with Sundays free after midday. It was fair. It was more than fair. "There is something I should tell you," Nora said, putting her fork down in the careful way she did when she was about to say something difficult. "I left Mr. Whitmore's employment because he made advances that I refused. He may say things about my character as a consequence. I want you to know the truth of it before you hear a distorted version from someone else." Cale set his coffee cup down slowly. His expression went through something she could not entirely read, though the line of his jaw told her something. "Gerald Whitmore," he said in a flat voice. "Yes," she said. "He has a reputation," Cale said after a pause. "Not a good one. I am sorry you encountered it." "You believe me," she said, and it was almost a question. "I believe you," he said simply and completely. It was, she would think later, one of the most startling things anyone had said to her in years. They rode out to the Double C that morning in his wagon, her carpet bag in the bed, the spring sun beginning to warm the hill country into something that almost resembled beauty. The land rolled in long, gentle curves covered in cedar and live oak, with limestone outcroppings rising pale and clean from the red earth. The sky was enormous, as Texas skies are, layered blue upon blue. The ranch was modest, functional, and honest, like the man who ran it. The house was a single story of stone and timber with a broad porch and a kitchen that smelled of old smoke and pine. Behind it stood a barn, a smokehouse, 2 smaller outbuildings, and a corral where 3 horses moved in lazy circles. The yard was not lovely, but it was clean, and Nora, who had been cleaning other people's spaces her entire life, could see immediately what could be made of it. Cale's 2 hands, Pete Ayala and an older man everyone called Stitch, looked up from their work with expressions that were curious but not unkind. Pete was perhaps 20, Mexican-born, with a broad grin that appeared at the corners of his mouth before it reached full expression. Stitch was perhaps 60, narrow as a fence rail, with a gray beard and the watchful eyes of a man who had survived many things. "This is Miss Callahan," Cale said. "She will be managing the house." Pete pulled his hat off with a kind of theatrical courtesy. Stitch simply nodded, but the nod was respectful. Nora set her bag in the small room off the kitchen, which had a wood-framed bed and a window that looked east over a stand of cedar trees, and she stood for a moment in the center of it and felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt, very cautiously, that things might be all right. She cooked supper that first evening from what she found in the pantry, which was not much: a haunch of salt pork, some dried beans, cornmeal, and a string of dried chili peppers hanging by the stove. She made beans cooked long and slow with the pork and peppers, and cornbread in the cast iron skillet, and strong coffee. When she brought it to the table, all 3 men went quiet in the way men go quiet when food smells unexpectedly good. "You can cook," Pete said, with the reverence of a young man who had been eating Stitch's cooking for the past 3 months, which was apparently not a pleasant situation. "I can cook," Nora agreed. Cal ate without speaking much, but she noticed he had a second serving and then a third, and when he brought his plate to the kitchen afterward, he stopped in the doorway and said, "Thank you, Miss Callahan. That was excellent." "It was just what was in the pantry," she said. "Most people would have made something a good deal less than excellent from what was in that pantry," he said, and then he went back to the evening's work, because there was always evening work on a ranch in the spring. She washed the dishes in the quiet kitchen and listened to the night come down over the hill country, the coyotes starting up their conversations across the dark land, an owl somewhere in the cedars, the distant sound of Cal in the barn, a lantern swinging across the gap between the buildings in a slow orange arc. She stood at the window and watched it and thought that she was here, that she had made it to here, and that here was a beginning. The days that followed had a rhythm that Nora recognized and was grateful for. She was up before dawn to start the stove and the coffee and the biscuits. The men came in from the early chores with cold hands and empty stomachs, and she fed them with the efficiency and abundance that she had learned, growing up in a household where food was how you showed you cared about people, because sometimes it was the only way you had. She packed the midday meals in tin pails and sent them out with Pete, and in the afternoons she managed the house and the pantry and planted a small kitchen garden in the south-facing strip of soil between the house and the fence. Cal paid attention to the garden. He did not say anything about it for the first several days, just noticed it each evening when he came back from the pastures, the neat rows she had turned and planted with seeds she had found in an old tin in the pantry. But one morning she looked up from weeding and found him standing at the garden's edge with his coffee, looking at the small, tender green shoots she had coaxed from the ground. "Tomatoes?" he asked. "And onions. And I think there were some bean seeds, though they may be too old to take," she said. "My grandmother used to keep a garden in this same spot," he said. "After she passed, I did not know what to do with it." She looked at him carefully because he had said it in a tone that was not entirely about the garden. "What was she like?" Nora asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the shoots. "Stubborn," he said. "Kind, practical. She came out here from Tennessee with my grandfather before the war when this country was barely settled. She built this house, or most of it, while my grandfather ran cattle. She had this way of making things look easier than they were." "I would have liked her," Nora said. He glanced at her then, quickly and then away, and something moved across his expression that she filed away without analyzing. "I think she would have liked you too," he said, and went back to the barn. Life on the Double C settled around her like a coat she had not expected to fit. She learned the rhythms of a working cattle ranch, the cycle of the pastures, the noise of a calf branding day, the particular silence of the hill country after a spring rain. She learned that Pete Ayala sent half his wages home to his mother in San Antonio every month, and that Stitch had a wooden box under his bunk that contained, as far as anyone knew, only a Bible and a photograph of a woman who was never discussed. She learned that Cale Donovan worked harder than any man she had ever seen, not frantically, but steadily, with the patient focus of a person who understood that the land requires consistent attention or it will not cooperate. She watched him, in the way you watch someone when you are not yet aware that watching has become something other than simple observation. She noticed that he was fair with his men and that they respected him for it, that Pete Ayala looked at him with the particular loyalty of a young man who has found a reliable person to look up to. She noticed that he was direct in all things, that he did not say things he did not mean, and did not mean things he did not say, which after Gerald Whitmore felt like water after thirst. She did not think about love. Love was a word she associated with the Irish ballads her mother used to sing, and with a kind of vulnerability that had always felt to her like standing too close to the edge of something. She thought about work, about the steady wage, about the garden coming up green, about the fact that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not afraid of what the next day would bring. April turned into May, and May brought the kind of warmth that turns the hill country goldenrod and wildflower mad, the meadows west of the ranch filling up with bluebonnets in such quantities that Pete said it looked like someone had spilled the sky. Nora rode out to see them one Sunday afternoon, which was her free time to do with as she wished. Cal had left one of the gentler horses, a dun mare named Cricket, saddled and available, saying with complete casualness that Cricket needed the exercise and he had no time for it, which she suspected was not entirely true but accepted graciously. She rode west into the bluebonnets and sat on Cricket's back at the center of that impossible color and breathed the air, which smelled of warmth and living things and the distant promise of rain. She was sitting there, hat in her lap, her brown hair loose around her shoulders in the way she never wore it when others could see, when she heard hoofbeats and turned to find Cal riding up on his bay. He stopped at the edge of the field and looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read at this distance. "I thought you said Cricket needed the exercise," she called. "Duke needed it more," he called back, which explained nothing, and he nudged the bay forward into the flowers. They rode for an hour together across the hill country without any particular destination. He pointed out landmarks, a limestone bluff to the north that he called Grandmother's Shelf, because his grandmother had loved to sit up there and look at the valley, a seasonal creek whose banks in February ran with wildflowers. She told him about New Orleans, about the narrow streets that smelled of river water and coffee and things blooming in December, a city so unlike this open country that it felt like talking about another planet. "You have been a lot of places," he said. "I have been to the places that work took me," she said. "It is different from choosing to go." "Where would you choose if you could go anywhere?" She thought about it honestly. "I do not think I have thought about it in those terms," she said. "I have always been thinking about the next necessary thing." He rode in silence for a moment. "That is a hard way to live." "It is the only way I know," she said without self-pity, just simply. He looked at her sideways and then ahead again and said nothing more about it, but she had the sense that he had heard it, really heard it, in the way he heard most things. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the form of Gerald Whitmore. He came to the Double C on a Wednesday in early June, driving his buckboard with the air of a man who owns the road, and he asked to speak to Cale Donovan. Nora was in the kitchen and heard him arrive and stayed where she was, her hands steady on the bread she was kneading, though her jaw was very tight. She could hear their voices on the porch, Whitmore's carrying that particular bluster of a man who has decided on a thing, Cal's lower and measured. She did not go to the door. She would not give Whitmore the satisfaction of showing that his presence rattled her. After perhaps 10 minutes, Whitmore's buckboard rolled back down the track toward the main road, and Cal came into the kitchen. She looked at him across the bread table. "What did he say?" Cal set his hat on the hook by the door with the deliberateness of a man organizing his thoughts. "He said you are a woman of bad character who left his employment after causing trouble. He said he is doing me a service by warning me." "And what did you say?" she asked, her voice perfectly level. "I told him to get off my property," Cal said, equally level. "And I told him that if he came back to repeat those words I would consider it a serious matter." Nora's hand stopped on the bread. She made herself breathe normally. "You did not ask me to explain myself," she said. "You did not ask for my side." "I know your side," he said. "I told you I believed you the morning we met. I do not change my mind about people based on what Gerald Whitmore tells me." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm with the smell of yeast and flour, and the light through the window was mid-morning gold, and she was aware of some kind of rearrangement happening in her chest, something shifting from its careful positioning. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You do not need to thank me for the truth," he said, and reached for the coffee pot and poured himself a cup and went back out to work. That evening, after supper, Nora sat on the porch in the cooling air and watched the stars come out. In the hill country, the stars came out with intent, not one or two at a time but in battalions, filling the dark from one horizon to the other. She had never known skies like this. In New Orleans, the light of the city softened everything, and in Mississippi the tree canopy closed the sky down to scraps. Out here the sky was everything. Cal came and sat in the other porch chair, which had become, without either of them deciding it, a thing they did in the evenings. Not always talking, sometimes just sitting in the comfortable way that people sit when they are at ease with each other, which itself was something Nora noticed and filed away. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "You are 28 and you run a good ranch, and you are clearly not an unpleasant person to be around. Why are you alone here?" He was quiet long enough that she wondered if she had overstepped, but then he said, "I was not always alone. I was engaged about 3 years ago to a woman named Clara Hess. She was from a good family in Austin. Her father decided I was not established enough, not enough land, not enough assets. She agreed with him, or she chose him over me, which amounts to the same thing." He paused. "After that I concentrated on the ranch." "I am sorry," Nora said. "Do not be," he said, without bitterness, just simply. "I think she was right that we were not suited. I think we both wanted a kind of ease that does not really exist, and when the ease was threatened she left and I built fences. Neither of those is exactly a love story." Nora looked at her hands in her lap. "No," she said. "What about you?" he asked, with the same quiet directness he applied to everything. "I have never had the luxury of romance," she said. "I have been working since I was 14. My mother needed me to." She paused. "I think I did not believe that love was something a person in my position could afford to want." He looked at her sideways. In the starlight, the planes of his face were very clear, and his expression was one she was beginning to recognize, thoughtful and attentive, the face of a man genuinely listening. "That seems like a considerable thing to give up on," he said. "You gave up on something similar," she said. "I gave up on one particular woman," he said. "I did not give up on the idea." She did not answer that, because she was not sure what to do with it, and they sat in the quiet that followed until the night had deepened enough that the air was cool, and it was time to go inside. Nora lay in her room that night with her hands folded on her chest and looked at the ceiling and had a very stern conversation with herself about practical matters. She was an employee. She had no family name, no dowry, no social standing. He came from a ranch family that, while not wealthy, had roots and land. She was a woman who had come to him with nothing but her hands and her honesty. She could not afford, in any direction, to be foolish. She was very firm about this, and then she thought about the way he said, "I know your side," and about the way the corners of his mouth moved when he was on the verge of a rare smile, and she sighed with considerable exasperation at herself and tried to sleep. June moved toward July, and the days became long and blazing, the kind of Texas summer heat that presses down on everything like a physical weight. Nora found ways to work efficiently in the heat, starting everything earlier, resting the kitchen fire in the afternoon, making cold suppers when the temperature made standing over the stove impractical. She brought cold water to the men working in the pastures, which was not in her job description but was simply sensible, and she saw the gratitude in Pete's young face and in the stoic nod that was Stitch's highest form of appreciation. One afternoon, she was carrying water out to the fence line where they were mending a stretch of wire when her foot caught on a root, and she went down, the pail sloshing, and she put her hand out and cut it on a rock, not badly but enough to bleed in the dramatic way hand cuts do. She was sitting in the dirt assessing the damage when Cal appeared from the other side of the fence. He had seen her fall and came through the gate at a pace that was not quite running but was close. He crouched down in front of her. "Are you hurt?" "Only my dignity," she said, holding up her hand to show him it was small. "And my hand, slightly." He took her hand in both of his to look at it, and the contact of his hands around hers was so unexpected and so warm that she forgot for a moment to breathe. He was looking at the cut with the same focused attention he brought to everything, his head bent, the brim of his hat close to her face. "It is not deep," he said. "We should clean it." "It is fine," she said. "It is not deep, but it should be cleaned," he said, with the particular firmness of a man who knows the danger of a small wound left to a summer's worth of Texas dirt. He walked her back to the house and brought out the small medicine kit his grandmother had kept in the kitchen cupboard, and he cleaned the cut himself with a care that was almost startling, his large hands very gentle, and he wrapped it in a strip of clean cloth with a neat precision. "You are good at that," she said. "Ranch life," he said. "You learn." He was still holding her bandaged hand, not doing anything with it, just holding it, and neither of them moved for a moment. She could feel the warmth of his hands through the bandage, and she thought that she had been lying to herself comprehensively for several weeks now. He looked up at her, and the look went on for exactly 1 beat longer than practical concern would require. Then he released her hand and stood up and said, in a voice that was carefully normal, "You should rest it for the afternoon." "I have bread to start," she said. "The bread can wait until tomorrow," he said, and went back out to the fence line. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that with her bandaged hand in her lap, having an argument with herself that she was losing badly. The town of Dry Creek had its social calendar, such as it was, and the 4th of July celebration in 1882 was one of its central events. The town organized a picnic on the square, with a fiddler and various contests, and nearly everyone within riding distance came in for it. Nora had been in Dry Creek long enough by now to have a face that people recognized, if not a name they knew well, and she went into town that morning with Cal on the wagon seat beside her while Pete and Stitch rode alongside. It was the first time she had been to town as anything other than an alone woman on a bench, and the difference was considerable. The town smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat and horses, and all the particular smells of a gathering of people who have been largely alone on the land. And there was a collective loosening that happened when the music started, when the fiddler struck up something Irish that made her feet want to move whether she gave them permission or not. She was standing with a plate of cake watching a pie-eating contest when she became aware that a woman had planted herself nearby with deliberate intent. The woman was perhaps 45, formidable in the way of someone who has organized everything within reach of her, with sharp gray eyes and the expensive for Dry Creek dress of someone who considers herself a social authority. "You are the girl working at the Donovan ranch," the woman said, as though stating something slightly irregular. "I am," Nora said pleasantly. "I am Helen Barker," the woman said. "My husband owns the Barker Mercantile. I run the ladies' auxiliary. I keep track of who is who in this town." "I can see that you do," Nora said, still pleasantly. Helen Barker looked at her with the assessing eyes of a woman performing a social calculation. "You have no family here," she said. "No, and no connections before you came." "None," Nora said, in a tone that was entirely pleasant and absolutely undeflated, which seemed to disconcert Helen Barker somewhat. "People will talk," Helen said conspiratorially, "about the arrangement you have with Cale Donovan, a young woman alone in a man's household." Nora looked at her evenly. "I am his housekeeper," she said. "It is a legitimate employment. I have a private room and I earn a fair wage, and the work is honest. I think the talking you are worried about says more about the people talking than about my situation." Helen Barker blinked. Clearly not many women spoke to her in this particular way. "Well," she said at length. "Would you like some of this cake?" Nora asked, offering her plate. "It is very good. Someone brought it with buttermilk icing." There was a pause, and then Helen Barker, to her own apparent slight surprise, took a piece of cake, and by the end of the afternoon she had introduced Nora to 4 other women in town and suggested she come to the ladies' auxiliary meeting on the 2nd Thursday of each month. Nora found Cal near the corral fence later in the afternoon, watching a roping demonstration with Pete. She stood beside him and said, without preamble, "Helen Barker is a complicated woman." He glanced at her with one of those nearly smiles. "She is," he agreed. "She is also the most effective person in Dry Creek when she decides to be useful." "I think I may have convinced her to be useful," Nora said thoughtfully. He looked at her with something in his expression that was warm and also, she thought, slightly awed. "I think," he said, "that you could convince most people of most things, Miss Callahan." The fiddler started something faster, a reel that had half the crowd on their feet, and Pete grabbed the nearest girl and spun her into the dancing with the invincible confidence of the young. And Stitch, who no one had ever seen dance, was suddenly and inexplicably dancing with Helen Barker's cook, and Nora was laughing, which she did not do often enough, and Cal was looking at her laughing as though the sound of it was something he wanted to hold on to. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. She looked up at him. The evening light was behind him and the music was quick and the world felt briefly possible. "I would like that very much," she said. They danced in the open square with the stars beginning and the music fast and his hand at her waist steady and warm, and she thought that she had lost the argument with herself entirely and that she could not be sorry about it. In the days that followed the 4th of July, something had shifted between them in a way that could not be unshifted. Not dramatically, not with any declaration, just the small continuous evidence of two people who have stopped pretending that they are not aware of each other. He brought her wildflowers from the pasture without ceremony, just set them in a jar on the kitchen table as though it were a practical matter, which it absolutely was not. She made his coffee with exactly the amount of sugar he preferred, which he had never told her and she had simply learned, and when he noticed she had learned it, his expression was a kind of question and an answer simultaneously. Pete noticed. Pete, who was 20 and generous-hearted and entirely without subtlety, noticed with an expressiveness that he was not entirely able to contain, and exchanged glances with Stitch that Stitch acknowledged with the world-weary amusement of a man who has seen this kind of thing unfold many times. What held them both in suspension was the thing that Nora had named to herself on the bench outside the general store that first morning, the gap between what she was and what the world required for such things to be uncomplicated. She had no family name that would give her standing in the community. She had no dowry, no land, no assets. She had come to him as an employee with $3.40 and a broken carpet bag. And in 1882 in the Texas Hill Country, these things mattered to other people even when they did not matter to you. She heard it at the ladies' auxiliary meeting in July, where Helen Barker, who had become a complicated sort of ally, mentioned in the careful way such women mention things that she hoped Nora understood her situation clearly. "A man like Cale Donovan," Helen said, not unkindly, "has a ranch to think about, a legacy. People will expect a woman with something to bring to it." Nora nodded as though this were useful information. On the inside, she pressed it flat and tried to keep it from doing damage. She said nothing to Cal about it. It was not a conversation she knew how to begin. What she did instead was work, which was the only response she had ever known. She made the kitchen garden into something extraordinary, the tomatoes coming in red and abundant, the beans climbing their strings, and she put up preserves in every jar she could find because the winter would come and the ranch would need them. She traded her surplus tomatoes at the general store for credit and used the credit for things the ranch needed, which Cal discovered when he looked at his accounts and found them more ordered than he had left them. He found her on the porch in the early evening with the account book and said, "Did you reorganize my accounts?" "Yes," she said, without apology. "You were paying double on the corn feed because you were ordering from 2 different suppliers without realizing it. I consolidated the orders." He looked at the book and then at her. "You are a remarkable woman," he said, quietly and completely seriously. "I am a practical one," she said, keeping her voice even. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said, and sat down in his chair. They sat in the quiet for a while. The night was warm and the crickets were loud, and somewhere across the pasture a barn owl was doing its hunting. "Nora," he said, with a particular weight on her name that was new. She looked at him. He seemed to be working up to something with unusual difficulty, which was not characteristic of him, as he was generally a direct man. He turned his hat in his hands, which was something she had never seen him do. "I need to say something that may be unwelcome," he said, "and I would rather say it plainly and have you know the truth of it than say nothing and have you think I have not been thinking it." She waited. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time." I am not sure exactly when it happened. I think it may have been the morning you told me you needed work and looked at me like you could see straight through any nonsense I might have offered." She was very still. "I know that your situation is complicated," he said, "and I know that there are people in this town who would say that a woman with no family name and no dowry is not what a man with a ranch ought to be reaching for, and I want to say very clearly that I do not care about any of that. I am not asking for a family name. I am not asking for land or money or connections. I am asking for you specifically, exactly as you are, because you are the person I want." Nora's hands were very still in her lap. She could feel the weight of the evening and the weight of what he had said pressing down on her in a way that was not entirely unpleasant but was very large. "People will say things," she said. "Helen Barker will say things. Helen Barker says things about everything," he said. "I have been listening to Helen Barker say things my entire life, and I am still standing." Something in her chest broke open the way ice breaks in spring, not violently but inevitably, because the temperature has finally changed enough that the old hardness can no longer hold. "I have no dowry," she said. "I have no family name. I came to you with $3.40 and a broken bag." "I know that," he said. "I only asked for you." She looked at him. He was entirely serious, entirely steady, looking at her with the direct Creekwater eyes and the expression of a man who has said the true thing and is prepared to wait as long as necessary for the answer. "I am in love with you too," she said, quietly and honestly, because she was not a woman who believed in saying less than the truth. "I have been trying not to be, because it seemed like a risk I could not afford, and I think I have been wrong about that." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand in his, the same hand he had bandaged in the kitchen, and held it with the same warmth. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Yes," she said, immediately and with complete certainty. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, over the small scar where the rock had cut her, and she felt it through every careful armor she had ever built. They told Pete and Stitch at breakfast the next morning. Pete's grin arrived in its usual sequence, corners first, and then erupted into something so large it seemed to take up too much of his face, and he pumped Cal's hand and told Nora he had known from the beginning, which was almost certainly true. Stitch stood up slowly from his chair, and he looked at Nora, and he said, "Ma'am," in a tone that contained everything a man like Stitch keeps ordinarily locked away, and then he shook Cal's hand with a grip that Cal said later was still reverberating at noon. They were married on the third Saturday of August 1882, in the Dry Creek Baptist Church, which smelled of beeswax candles and old hymnals, and the particular sacred smell of a building where people have been sincere for many years. The preacher was a round man named Reverend Abbott who had a tremendous beard and a genuine kindness that came through in even the most conventional ceremony. Nora wore a dress that Helen Barker had helped her make, which was a thing neither of them had quite anticipated. Helen had shown up at the ranch 3 weeks before the wedding with blue cotton and a pattern and a firm opinion about bodices, and Nora had decided that some battles were better fought than others, and that the dress was not one of them. The result was the most beautiful thing Nora had ever worn, blue as the evening sky over the hill country, with small pearl buttons that Helen produced from what she described as her personal resources. Cal stood at the front of the church in a suit that did not quite fit, because he had bought it for Clara Hess's engagement party, and he was slightly broader across the shoulders than he had been 3 years ago. But Pete had let out the seams with the careful incompetence of someone who has never actually sewn in his life, and Stitch had finished the job with a swift, efficient needle that revealed hidden talents. Nora walked down the aisle alone, which she had expected, and which did not make her sad, because she had been walking alone for a long time and was not ashamed of it. She walked with the straight back and the direct gray gaze and the blue dress and the small bunch of wildflowers she had cut from the pasture that morning, and Cal watched her come, and his expression was so open, and unguarded that several women in the pews were moved by it without entirely knowing why. "Do you have a ring?" the Reverend asked at the appropriate moment. Cal produced a ring, which he had ordered from San Antonio, plain gold with a small engraved pattern of bluebonnets around the band, because he was a man who thought about things. He slid it onto her finger and she looked at it and then at him. "I only asked for you," he said, very quietly just for her, and her eyes went bright with something she would not let be tears in front of all of Dry Creek. "And I said yes," she said, equally quiet, equally certain. They had the kind of wedding reception that frontier towns do with genuine enthusiasm, which is to say a great deal of food brought by everyone, a fiddler who played until his bow arm ached, tables set up in the square under the late summer sky, and a community collective in its celebration in the way that isolated communities sometimes are, fierce about their gatherings because the next one might be months away. Even Helen Barker danced, having apparently made her peace with the situation, entirely, once she decided that Nora Callahan Donovan was someone who was going to matter in Dry Creek, and therefore someone worth knowing properly. Nora danced with Cal in the center of the square under the stars that were, as always, completely abundant in the Texas sky, and she thought that she had come here with $3.40 and had somehow arrived at this, at his hands and this music and the hill country air, and the accounting of it did not add up mathematically and she did not care. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice low near her ear. "I am startlingly happy," she said, which was a completely accurate statement, and she felt his arm tighten slightly around her waist. The months that followed were the months of building a life together rather than building a situation, which are very different kinds of work. The ranch house changed in small ways that accumulated into something considerably larger, the kitchen garden growing to twice its original size, the porch getting the sweep and repair it had needed, the front room gaining a bookshelf that Nora built herself from lumber she bought with 3 months of careful savings, and which Cal came home to find standing against the wall one evening, filled with the small collection of books that had survived her travels in her carpet bag. He ran his hand along the spines and turned to look at her where she was making supper. "You built this," he said. "It is not complicated work," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother would have done the same thing," he said, and she understood that was everything. She learned the ranch in the way she learned everything, completely and practically. She learned which pastures the cattle preferred in summer and which they drifted to in the fall. She learned to read the weather coming in off the hills, the particular quality of the cloud on the northwest horizon that meant rain was genuine and not merely threatening. She learned to ride Cricket with an ease that grew over the weeks until Cricket and she had an understanding, and she went out into the pastures and helped with the cattle in ways that were not traditional for a woman of her time but were efficient, and that Cal never once suggested were improper. Pete, who had grown from an employee into something closer to a younger brother over the months, taught her to rope from Cricket's back with an enthusiasm that exceeded his actual skill as a teacher, resulting in several very tangled afternoons. But by the winter she could manage a simple catch with consistency that Pete celebrated as though she had performed a miracle. "You did not have to do all of that," Cal said one evening, watching her hang the rope back on its peg in the barn. "I know," she said. "I wanted to understand it." "Understand what?" "This place," she said. "All of it. Your work, the land, it matters to me." He looked at her across the barn in the lantern light, and in his expression was the look that she was learning to read as fluently as words on a page, the particular warmth of a man who cannot believe his luck, without also believing that luck is not entirely the right word for it. He crossed the barn and put his arms around her and held her in the uncomplicated way that people who love each other hold each other, without performance or occasion, just because the impulse is there. "I love you," he said, into her hair. "I love you," she said, into his shoulder. October brought the first real cold. the hill country autumn coming in with the particular fierceness of a season that has waited long enough, and the ranch settled into the winter patterns, firewood and preserved food, and the deep quiet of land under a gray sky. Nora had put up 40 jars of tomatoes and 20 of green beans and 16 of peach preserves from the tree at the pasture's edge, and the pantry had a fullness that she stood before sometimes and felt a satisfaction in that was almost physical. She discovered in November that she was pregnant. She told Cal on a Sunday evening after supper on the porch, which had by now a particular significance as the place where true things were said between them. He was very still for a moment after she told him. Then he turned to look at her, and his face had an expression she had never seen on it before, something so open and unguarded and large that she thought he might not know what to do with it. "A baby," he said. "In the spring, I think," she said. "Late spring." He reached out and took her hand and held it, looking out at the dark hill country, and she watched him absorbing the vastness of it. "Are you frightened?" he asked after a while. "Yes," she said honestly. "A little, are you?" "Yes," he said. "A lot." And then, slowly, he began to smile, not the corner-first smile she was used to, but something much bigger than that, something that rearranged the whole landscape of his face. "We are going to have a baby," he said, as though saying it again confirmed it. "It would appear so," she said, smiling back. He stood up and pulled her to her feet and held her carefully and kissed her with a tenderness that she thought might undo her entirely, and she held onto the lapels of his coat and let herself be held. The winter of 1882 moving into 1883 was cold, but not cruel, the hill country dipping into hard freezes only twice, and both times the ranch came through without serious losses. Cal was attentive throughout Nora's pregnancy in the way of a man who has decided that attentive is what he will be, which meant he did not hover but he paid attention, carried things without being asked, made sure she had what she needed without making her feel managed. She appreciated this greatly because she was not a woman who tolerated management, which he already knew. They talked, in the evenings on the porch or in the warm kitchen, about the baby and about the future, but also about other things, the kind of conversations that build between two people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds. She told him about New Orleans and about her mother, who had been Irish-born and sharp-witted and very funny, who had come to America with nothing and made something out of it, and who had, in Nora's earliest memories, danced in the kitchen to tunes she sang herself. He told her about his grandfather, who had come to Texas before the war and had built the first version of this house with his own hands, and about his grandmother, who had run the ranch for 3 years while the grandfather went to war and came back changed, and who had kept everything intact by what must have been sheer force of personality. "She sounds like you," Nora said. "I thought of that," he said. "The first time I saw you on that bench." She raised an eyebrow. "You thought I reminded you of your grandmother when you saw me." He laughed at that, which was a thing she had learned to produce with some regularity and was always pleased by because his laugh was rare enough to be genuinely valuable. "Not like that," he said. "I thought she had the same quality, of being completely herself regardless of the circumstances." Nora considered this. "I have never been able to be anything else," she said. "I never had enough to spare for pretending. That is one of the things I love most about you," he said. In April of 1883, Dry Creek had a small drama that brought the community together in the way small frontier towns both generate and solve their own dramas. A fire started in the hayloft of the livery stable on a dry April night, and by the time the alarm was raised, it had spread to the roof of the adjacent building and threatened the whole southeast corner of the main street. Cal was among the first men there with the bucket brigade, and Nora arrived with every other woman in the vicinity, organizing water, directing people, keeping the chaos from becoming ungovernable. She was 7 months pregnant and absolutely uninterested in this being relevant, and she moved through the smoke and the shouting with the calm efficiency that she brought to difficult situations, and she organized the women into a system that doubled the speed of the water relay. By the time the fire was out at close to midnight, the livery stable was gone and 2 buildings were damaged, but nothing else had been lost, including lives. The owner of the livery stable, an old man named Cressy who was 70 and had built the place himself 30 years ago, sat on a barrel in the street and looked at what remained of it, and Nora sat beside him and put her hand over his and did not say anything at all, which was exactly the right thing to do. Helen Barker, appearing with a blanket and coffee as though she had anticipated the need, looked at Nora sitting with old Cressy in the way that contains a complete revision of opinion. She said nothing at the time, but 2 weeks later she presented Nora with a hat, a very good hat with blue ribbon, saying it was from the ladies' auxiliary. Nora wore it to church the following Sunday and felt that she had arrived somewhere, which might have been funny if it had not also been genuinely moving. The baby arrived on a morning in late May 1883, in the bedroom of the ranch house with the east window showing the cedar trees coming into their summer green, and a breeze moving the curtain like a gentle hand. Mrs. Flores, who was the nearest thing Dry Creek had to a midwife, came from town the night before when the labor began and was calm and competent and spoke to Nora in a mixture of English and Spanish that was somehow exactly right. Cal paced the front porch for 6 hours. Pete paced alongside him in solidarity for at least 3 of those 6 hours, and Stitch sat on the porch steps and whittled a small wooden horse with the focused patience of a man who cannot control events but can make something while they unfold. At 7:30 in the morning, a sound came from inside the house that made all 3 men stop entirely. Mrs. Flores appeared at the door a few minutes later and said, "A boy, healthy. Your wife is very well." Cal went inside. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at Nora, who was propped against the pillows with the exhausted and triumphant look of someone who has done a thing of enormous physical consequence, and in her arms was a small red-faced person who was, even at first glance, clearly going to have his father's dark hair. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them and could not speak for a moment. Nora looked at him looking at the baby, and she thought that this, right here, was the full weight of the decision she had made. Every step from the bench outside the general store to this room, every moment of uncertainty and careful hope and stubborn quiet love, had led to this man sitting on the edge of this bed looking at their son with his face completely undone with feeling. "Hello," he said softly to the baby, who regarded him with the dark, unfocused gaze of the newly arrived. "He needs a name," Nora said. "James," Cal said without hesitation. "After my grandfather." "James Donovan," she said, trying it. "James Patrick Donovan," he said, looking at her, "if you will allow the Patrick." Her mother's father, whom Nora had never known but had only known as a name in her mother's stories, Patrick, who had come from County Clare with nothing and worked the docks in New Orleans until his hands were leather. "James Patrick Donovan," she said, and her throat was very tight. "That is a fine name for a person." He leaned down and pressed his forehead gently to hers, the baby between them, and she felt the entirety of it, the weight and the warmth and the absolute rightness. "I love you," he said. "Both of you, we love you," she said. The summer of 1883 was the fullest summer Nora had ever known, which was saying something, since most of her life had been occupied entirely with the work of keeping herself afloat. Now there was James, who was an astonishing amount of person for someone so recently arrived in the world, and there was Cal, who turned out to be the kind of father she had somehow known he would be, present and warm and unafraid of the baby's smallness. He carried James in the crook of his arm around the ranch, with a matter-of-factness that made Pete watch with a kind of wistful wonder, and Stitch absolutely refuse to look directly at them for the first 3 weeks, which everyone understood was his way of managing emotion. Pete held James for the first time with the stiff terror of a young man confronted with something fragile, and then James grabbed Pete's finger with the grip that babies have, disproportionate and absolute, and Pete's expression transformed into something astonished and gentle. "He is very strong," Pete said in an awed voice. "He is 3 weeks old," Cal said. "He is still very strong," Pete said firmly. Gerald Whitmore did not entirely disappear from the landscape, because small towns do not allow anyone to disappear entirely, but he was reduced to a presence that had to acknowledge Nora's existence without being able to do anything about it. He saw her in town one afternoon when she was at the general store with James in her arms, and he stopped on the boardwalk with the particular expression of a man who has miscalculated. Nora looked at him with the direct gray gaze. "Mr. Whitmore," she said pleasantly. He tipped his hat and moved on, which was all he could do, and Nora watched him go and thought that she felt nothing about him anymore, which was the most complete form of victory. Helen Barker, who had witnessed this exchange from the doorway of the Mercantile, came to stand beside her with the satisfied air of someone who has seen justice administered. "You handled that beautifully," Helen said. "I did not handle anything," Nora said. "I simply existed, which I will continue to do." Helen made a sound that was as close to a laugh as Helen generally produced in public. "Come to the auxiliary meeting Thursday," she said. "I am proposing we fund the new schoolhouse roof, and I will need someone sensible to support the motion." "I will be there," Nora said. Life in Dry Creek, for Nora Donovan, became over the following years the kind of thing that is built rather than found, assembled from days and decisions, and the accumulation of mornings that begin with coffee, and a child learning to stand in the kitchen, and a man who comes in from the barn and stops first to kiss her on the temple before he reaches for the cup, not because he thinks about it, but because he does not have to. She became, in the way of women who have been tested by necessity, a person of considerable standing in the community, not the standing of family name or inherited wealth, but the standing that comes from being someone who shows up when things are difficult. When the schoolteacher's wife fell ill in the winter of 1884, Nora organized meals for the family without being asked and without making a show of it. When a family of new settlers arrived from Missouri that spring with too little money and too much hope, she found them work and helped them navigate the particular cruelties of establishing yourself on new land. Cal watched her do all of these things and said, one evening, "You are becoming the grandmother of Dry Creek." She looked at him with mock severity. "I am 24 years old." "I meant it as the highest compliment," he said, with the full smile that she had learned to treasure for its rarity. "My grandmother ran half the county from this porch. You are doing the same thing." She looked out at the hill country in the evening light. The ranch had grown 300 acres now to what had been 150 when she arrived, because Cal worked with patient purpose and because the combined efficiency of two people who are well suited to each other produces results that exceed either one alone. "I love this place," she said. "I know," he said. "It shows." James turned too and discovered that he could run, which he applied to the full extent of his abilities in every direction, requiring constant vigilance. He had his father's coloring and his mother's eyes, and an absolute certainty about himself that both of them found exhausting and miraculous. He called Pete Pete and Stitch simply Mister, and he followed Stitch around the barn with the devotion of a small planet in orbit. And Stitch, who had maintained his emotional composure through most of the boy's life, finally and entirely capitulated and built James a small rocking horse from cedar wood with a real leather saddle the size of a dinner plate, which he presented without ceremony and without any acknowledgement that it had taken him 4 months of evenings. Nora held the rocking horse and looked at Stitch and said quietly, "Thank you, Stitch. He will love this his whole life." Stitch nodded. "Good horse," he said, which covered everything. In the fall of 1884, Pete told them he was going back to San Antonio. His mother was ill and needed him, and besides that, he had met a girl named Rosalia at the 4th of July dance who had written him 3 letters since, which was as clear a message as a woman sends. He told them over supper with the careful formality of someone who has thought about how to say a difficult thing. Nora put down her fork and looked at him across the table. "Is she worth going back for?" she asked. Pete's grin arrived in its characteristic sequence. "She is worth everything," he said. Then go, she said. Cal nodded. You will always have work here if you need it, but go be with her. Pete left on a Tuesday morning in October, on the southbound stage with his wages, a jar of Nora's peach preserves. The cedar rocking horse carving Stitch had made him as a going-away gift, a miniature of James's horse, with a tiny rider, and the sort of confidence that comes from having spent time in a place where you were genuinely valued. He hugged Nora with the unself-conscious affection of someone who considers her family, which is what she was to him by then, shook Cal's hand, and then pulled him into the embrace of a young man who does not know how to say gratitude in words, and crouched down and told James very seriously that he was leaving him in charge of cricket, which James accepted with the gravity of someone given important responsibility. They got a letter from San Antonio in December. Pete had married Rosalia on the 1st of November. There were 2 small sketches included, one of the wedding and one of their apartment, drawn by Rosalia, who had a clear and charming hand. Nora pinned them to the kitchen wall next to the window that looked east, and they stayed there. In the spring of 1885, Nora discovered she was pregnant again. She told Cal in the kitchen this time in the morning, because there was no particular need for ceremony when you have already been through it once together. She just said, over breakfast, I think there will be another baby in the autumn. He looked up from his coffee. His expression went through the same sequence as before, stillness, then that large unguarded openness, then the smile. Autumn, he said. October, perhaps, she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and James, who was sitting between them eating biscuit with the focused industry of a 2-year-old, looked up and said, very clearly, What? Both of them laughed, and James, pleased with the effect, said it again. The autumn baby was a girl, born on a clear October morning when the cedar trees were beginning to bronze at the tips, and the air had that particular quality of Texas October that is the best kind of air in the world. They named her Maeve, for Nora's mother, who had danced in the kitchen to songs she sang herself, and who had deserved more than she got, but who had, in her way, given Nora everything she needed to survive long enough to find this. Maeve arrived with a pair of lungs that immediately made clear she intended to be heard, which Pete's letter responded to, when it arrived in November, with the assessment that this was entirely appropriate given whose daughter she was. Cal held Maeve in the first hour of her life with the additional ease of a man who has done this before, standing at the bedroom window while Nora slept, and Stitch came to the doorway and looked at the scene in the low morning light, this man with his daughter, in this house that 3 generations of his family had built. Stitch said nothing. He just nodded once slowly, the deepest and most complete nod in his considerable repertoire, and went back to the barn. By the winter of 1885, Nora had been in Dry Creek for 3.5 years. The kitchen garden had expanded into a proper kitchen farm. The ranch house had a second room added off the back for the children, built over the summer by Cal and the new hand they had taken on, a quiet young man named Rufus Ellis, who was 19 and from East Texas, and had appeared one morning asking for work with the same combination of directness and need that Nora recognized from her own arrival. She had taken one look at him and told Cal to hire him, which Cal did without requiring further discussion, because he had learned to trust her reading of people, which was consistently and inexplicably accurate. Rufus turned out to be invaluable with the cattle, and to have a capacity for steady work that Stitch approved of, which was the relevant endorsement on the Double C Ranch. Nora sat on the porch one evening in December, with Maeve asleep against her shoulder and James sitting on the porch steps explaining something complex and incoherent to the barn cat, which was listening with profound patience, and Cal came out and sat beside her, and the hill country was dark and cold and entirely full of stars. I was thinking, he said, about what your life looked like when you walked into this town. She looked at him. $3.40, he said, a broken bag. And no family name and no dowry, she said. I believe you could have had better. "Could I?" he said in the tone of a man asking a genuinely curious question. She looked at him steadily, this man she had not expected and had not been able to avoid, with his creekwater eyes and his unhurried manner and his hands that were always careful and always warm. "No," she said. "I do not think you could have." "Neither do I," he said. James had given up on explaining things to the cat and had come back to the porch steps, and he leaned against his father's legs with the absolute confidence of a child who has never had cause to doubt that the weight of him is welcome. And Cal's hand came down onto his son's dark head with the ease of the most natural gesture in the world. The years settled down around them in the way of years that have found their proper shape. The Double C grew to 400 acres by 1887. Stitch, who had been ageless for as long as anyone could tell, became in the spring of 1887 clearly old, not in one sudden moment, but in the accumulating way of people who have held themselves carefully for a very long time and have finally allowed themselves to set the weight down. He began sleeping later and working shorter days, and Cal restructured the work so quietly and so practically that Stitch never had to acknowledge that it had been restructured. In the fall of 1887, Stitch came to find Nora in the kitchen one morning while everyone else was out, which was unusual enough that she turned from the stove immediately. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen him do, and he looked at her for a moment with the careful look of a man coming to the end of something. "I want to show you something," he said. He brought out the wooden box from under his bunk that no one had ever asked about, and he opened it and showed her what was inside. The Bible she had known about. The photograph she had known about. A young woman in an old daguerreotype, dark-eyed and smiling with one side of her mouth. "My wife," he said. "Eleanor, she died in '63. We had a boy. He died in the same fever. I went to work after that and I did not stop working." Nora looked at the photograph and then at Stitch. She said nothing. "I wanted someone to know," he said, "before." "I am glad to know," she said gently. "She has a kind face." "She was a kind woman," he said. She poured him coffee and he sat at her kitchen table and they talked for an hour about Eleanor, who had been a schoolteacher from Georgia, and about the boy who had been 4 when he died and had loved horses above all things. Nora listened with her full attention, because this was what Stitch needed, to have them be real to someone who would remember them, and she would remember them. Stitch died on a quiet morning in January of 1888, in his bunk peacefully, which Rufus found when he came to call him for breakfast. They buried him on the high ground east of the ranch, on a limestone ridge where the view across the valley was very long, because it seemed right for a man who had spent his life looking at distances. Nora planted a cedar tree on the grave in the spring, because cedars live for a very long time, and because he had deserved something permanent. James was 5 by then and understood death in the incomplete way of 5-year-olds, and he stood at the grave in his small hat and said, "Mr. made my horse." "He did," Nora said, taking his hand. "Is the horse still mine?" "Yes," she said. "Good," James said, with the simple logic of someone for whom love and possession are not yet distinct concepts, which in its way was a kind of truth. The cattle operation expanded in 1888 with the acquisition of the adjoining 40 acres from a neighbor who was moving his family to New Mexico, and Cal hired 2 more hands, brothers from the German settlements near Fredericksburg, capable and steady. The Double C became one of the more reliable operations in the county, not the largest but known for consistent quality, which in the cattle business is its own form of prosperity. Nora had by 1888 become, without quite deciding to, one of the central figures of the Ladies' Auxiliary of Dry Creek, which under her and Helen Barker's combined influence had funded the new schoolhouse roof, a lending library of 12 books kept at the general store, and a community well east of town that served 3 families who had previously walked half a mile for water. Helen Barker, who had initially viewed Nora's lack of family name and dowry as a social complication, had revised this position so thoroughly that she now occasionally introduced Nora to visitors as our most indispensable woman, which was high praise from a woman who did not dispense it cheaply. Nora was 28. She had a ranch, a husband, 2 children, a kitchen garden, a rocking horse on a cedar grave, and 40 jars of tomatoes in the pantry. She stood one morning in the garden in the warm spring light and looked at what she had grown and thought about $3.40, about a bench outside a general store, about the first morning she had sat in Macready's dining room across from a man with unhurried eyes and let herself be honest about what she needed. She thought about her mother dancing in the kitchen, and about Alina in the daguerreotype with her sideways smile, and about all the women who had built things in difficult country and had not been remembered by any name that history kept. She was not going to be forgotten, not in the places where it mattered. James would know her, Maeve would know her, and any child who came after, and the ladies' auxiliary records would show her name, and the schoolhouse roof would not have been repaired without her, and the well east of town would stand for years, and every jar of preserves she had put up was itself a small monument to surviving winter. Cal found her in the garden in the middle of this thought, which was where he often found her, and he came and stood beside her as he did, looking at the rows of new green growth. "James wants to ride with me this afternoon to check the east fence," he said. "He is 5, she said. "He has been riding cricket since he was 4, he said. She looked at him sideways with the gray eyes. "He will worry about nothing but falling." "He will not fall," Cal said. "I will not let him fall." She looked at her husband, who said things he meant and meant things he said, who had walked back to her bench with his morning coffee when he absolutely should have ridden on, who had built a room for their children and a bookshelf for her and a grave marker for Stitch and a ranch that was fed by the work of both their hands. "All right," she said, "but his hat must be on properly. He loses it on the gallop." "I will tie it under his chin," Cal said with complete seriousness. "He will not like that," she said. "No," Cal agreed, "but he will not lose the hat." In the summer of 1888, they received a letter from Pete Ayala in San Antonio. He and Rosalia had a daughter born in May, named Clara Nora, the second name for, as Pete wrote in his generous looping script, "The woman who taught me that it matters how you treat people and who makes the best beans in the state of Texas." Nora folded the letter carefully and put it with the sketches on the kitchen wall. She wrote back congratulating them and included 2 jars of peach preserves, with the next supply wagon going south and a small cedar carving she had made herself, imperfect but recognizable, of a horse, for Clara Nora, who would need something to hold while she was learning the world. The years of the late 1880s moved with the particular texture of a life that is complete. Not finished, never finished, always something still in progress, another fence line to mend, or another cold snap to prepare for, or another decision about which pasture to rotate the cattle to, but complete in the way that means nothing essential is missing. James was a boy who loved horses with his whole soul, which surprised no one, and he had Cal's patience and his mother's directness, a combination that made the schoolteacher in Dry Creek describe him, in a letter to his mother about his school performance, as very clear-eyed. Maeve was 4 years old in the fall of 1889, and was already demonstrating the kind of personality that would be either extraordinary or exhausting depending on the day, with her mother's gray gaze and her father's quiet stubbornness, and a laugh that she had entirely from herself. On the evening of Nora and Cal's 7th anniversary in August of 1889, they sat on the porch in the warm dark, the children asleep, Rufus and the new hands settled for the night, the hill country making its nocturnal sounds all around them, coyotes and crickets and the occasional distant dog. Cal poured them each a small glass of the good whiskey he kept for occasions, and they sat with it in the easy companionship of people who have been through enough together that silence is never empty. 7 years, he said. 7 years, she agreed. He turned the glass in his hands. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," she said. "The morning I rode into town and you were on that bench," he said. "I think about how I almost did not stop. I had a list of things to do, and the sensible thing was to do them and go back to the ranch. But you stopped, she said. I stopped, he said. I do not know if it was sense or foolishness or grace. She was quiet for a moment. I think it was all three, she said. At the same time. He reached out and took her hand. His ring was on his left hand, plain gold, no engraving, practical, which was how he had chosen it, and her ring was on her left hand with the bluebonnets around the band that she still thought about sometimes. The man who had ordered bluebonnets because he thought about things. You are, he said, looking at her in the dark, the best decision I have ever made. Or rather, the best almost mistake I ever caught before it became one. Nearly riding past me, she said. Yes, he said. I am extremely glad I did not. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she did that he never moved for, always stayed perfectly still so she could stay perfectly there. I am glad you did not too, she said. They sat there in the warm dark of the Texas hill country with the stars coming out in their deliberate battalions, and the ranch around them was quiet and whole, the horses in the corral, the children asleep, the kitchen garden coming to the end of its summer abundance, the pantry full of what they had put up together, the graves on the ridge, the cedar tree growing slow and certain over Stitch's memory. Nora Callahan Donovan had come to Dry Creek in the spring of 1882 with $3.40 and no family name and no dowry and a carpenter bag with a broken clasp, and she had built from those materials and from her own two hands, and from the unlikely grace of a man on a bay horse who stopped when he should have ridden on, an entire life. Not a borrowed life, not a tolerated life, not a life that existed at someone else's permission. Her own life in her own name, in a house she had made into a home, in a garden she had grown from seed, with a man who had said, when people suggested she brought nothing with her, that he had only asked for her. And she had said yes. And here was what yes had grown into: the 7 years and the 2 children and the kitchen farm and the preserved peaches, and the letters from Pete pinned to the kitchen wall and the cedar tree on the ridge and the bookshelf. She had built herself and the ladies' auxiliary and the schoolhouse roof and the well east of town, and every jar in the pantry and every morning that began with coffee and ended on this porch under these particular stars. She raised her whiskey glass slightly. To 7 more years, she said. He raised his. To all of them, he said, everyone we get. They clinked the glasses together in the dark, and the sound was small and clear and carried just far enough into the hill country night to mean something, though there was no one out there to hear it except the stars, which had been listening to things like this for a very long time and had no intention of stopping. The ranch would go on. James would learn the fence lines as his father had learned them, riding out on mornings that smelled of cedar and warming stone, and he would bring the knowledge of the land into himself, the way the land allows itself to be known, slowly and completely. Maeve would grow into herself with the unstoppable force of a person who has never been told, in the home where it counted most, that she was less than entirely worthy of the space she occupied. Rufus Ellis would work the Double C for 20 years and eventually marry a woman from the German settlements who made him extraordinarily happy. Pete and Rosalia would come up from San Antonio with young Clara Nora in the summer of 1890 for a visit that lasted 2 weeks and was loud and full and perfect. Clara, Nora, and James developing the kind of instant affinity that children sometimes form with no particular reason, and Pete standing in the kitchen looking at everything that the kitchen had become and eating 3 servings of Nora's beans with the expression of a man completing a circle. Helen Barker would tell her own grandchildren, decades later, about Nora Donovan, describing her as the woman who had walked into Dry Creek with nothing but herself and made it into something, which was not perfectly accurate but was true in the way that matters when you are trying to explain to young people what a person can be. And Nora, standing in the kitchen garden on a morning that smelled of tomatoes and earth and the particular sweetness of late summer, would sometimes stop and hold very still and feel the fullness of it, the accumulated weight of all the yes she had said and all the work she had done and all the love she had chosen to stop being afraid of. And she would think of herself on that bench, 22 years old, $3.40, the whole terrifying world ahead of her. She had been so afraid. She had been so brave. And the man who had stopped his horse had asked her what he could do to help, and she had told him the honest truth of what she needed, and he had offered what he had, and she had taken it, and neither of them had known yet what they were beginning. He had asked for nothing she could not give. He had wanted her, exactly as she was, no dowry and no family name and no connections and no history that anyone in Dry Creek could verify. Just her in the precise specificity of her, with her gray eyes and her straight back and her bread and her garden and her kitchen accounts and her honest face. She had given him that. She gave it still, every morning without reservation. And he gave her this, every day, this life, this place, this belonging. She put her hands in the earth and felt the roots of things. And above her the Texas sky was enormous and blue and entirely unreserved. And inside the house she could hear James telling Maeve something with great urgency and Maeve responding with total disagreement. And somewhere Cal's boots were on the porch boards, and he was coming to find her as he always did, as he always would. And she was here, entirely and completely here, and she was home.